When a text from an unknown number turns Matt's world upside down, he uncovers more than he ever expected. Watch how one man's quiet suspicions lead to the ultimate confrontation in a story filled with shocking twists. I remember the first time I met Rachel. She was captivating, full of energy, the kind of woman who could step into any room and instantly capture everyone's attention without saying a word. Life has a strange way of dulling that initial spark over time, taking what once felt alive and gradually dimming it into a memory. In those early days, we were inseparable, lost in shared laughs, lingering glances, and long nights talking until the sun came up. Her joy fueled mine, reminding me that there was more to life than just getting through the day. Back then, I was just a young mechanic named Matt, with oil-stained hands and a mind full of dreams. Living in Denver, I was 29, and Rachel, at 27, brought a kind of light into my life. She seemed to love me for who I was, or at least, it felt that way. Fast forward about 12 years, and things had settled into something more predictable, almost stagnant. I'd become the guy who left for work before dawn and came home when streetlights glowed. The shop where I worked, Canyon Auto, paid the bills, but it wasn't mine. Every extra shift, every new callus on my hands, was part of a promise to myself. One day, I'd open Matt's Motorworks, a place where I could finally be my own boss and build something that felt like mine. But chasing a dream comes with sacrifices. The mornings we'd once shared over coffee turned into quick hellos, and even the little things, like a touch as we passed in the hallway, became rarer. Rachel's once bright smile had become a shadow, a little less visible with each passing day until one day, I realized it was gone. She was still beautiful, still radiant in her way, but now it felt like I was only seeing an echo of the woman I once knew. Tired from work and life's obligations, I didn't ask questions. It was easier to believe we were just busy, and that this was how long-term relationships worked. My own stubbornness didn't let me see what was happening. A distance had grown between us, the kind that sneaks up on you until it feels like an unspoken wall. I'd come home to find Rachel on the couch, her eyes fixed on a show she wasn't truly watching, or scrolling through her phone with a far-off look, as if she were someplace else entirely. I'd nod, mutter something about dinner, and shuffle off to change out of my oil-streaked clothes. We spoke, but our conversations were pared down to the essentials: groceries, bills, the neighbor's noisy dog. We never spoke about our dreams or our life together. I'd grown accustomed to the silence, much like the dull ache in my hands after a long day of tightening bolts and replacing worn parts. Our shared time felt scheduled, hollow. Date nights dwindled to nearly nothing, replaced by her mentioning plans with her friends or needing a break. At first, I thought it was healthy for her to get out, enjoy life while I clocked in hours at the shop to save up for my dream. But somewhere deep down, I knew. When your partner starts finding life outside of the space you both once filled together, it means more than just needing fresh air, it's the beginning of something slipping away. And still, I convinced myself that she'd come back, that things would return to how they'd been, that I'd walk into our home one day to find her waiting for me with that old, familiar smile. But life doesn't grant such wishes easily. It started with little shifts that seemed harmless at first. Rachel's schedule started filling up with new activities, classes, spontaneous meetups with friends. She told me about a new fitness routine that had her excited, spinning classes at a place called Rev Up Studio, and some high-intensity workouts to mix things up. I'd nod, offering a tired smile as I scrubbed grease from my hands after a long shift. That's good, I'd say, though my words felt as mechanical as the engine parts one worked with all day. In my mind, she deserved to have her own life outside of our increasingly routine home. But gradually, her outings became more frequent, her time away stretched beyond what could be explained by a casual workout or a quick drink with friends. More often than not, I'd come home to an empty house, silence filling the rooms as I ate my dinner alone, standing over the sink or in front of the TV. The couch still bore the impression where she'd sat, a shadow of her presence as I listened to the hollow tick of the clock, waiting for the faint sound of keys turning in the lock. "How was your night?" I'd ask when she eventually returned, her smile barely there, her responses clipped and vague. It was fine, she'd reply, already walking past me toward the bedroom, brushing off my attempts at conversation. Weekends had once been our time, our break from the grind. We'd drive out of the city, exploring diners with cheap coffee and greasy food, or spend quiet afternoons at home with her reading a novel while I tinkered with old car parts. Now, weekends were broken up by new plans, last-minute outings she'd announce as she headed for the door. "I'm meeting the girls," she'd call over her shoulder, grabbing her purse and leaving me standing in the kitchen, feeling like an afterthought. I told myself it was a phase, that we were just going through a rough patch. I blamed my long hours, which left me drained and distant by the time I got home. But when I noticed her spending more time in front of the mirror, carefully picking her outfits, something in my chest tightened. She looked happier, energized in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, and I couldn't tell if it was the excitement of seeing friends, or something else entirely. Routine has a way of masking things that run deeper. She'd give me a quick, cold peck on the cheek, the kind that didn't linger, and I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling while she texted in the dark, the glow from her phone casting sharp shadows across her face. The little laughs and murmurs I heard convinced me it was innocent, but doubt has a way of sneaking in, rooting itself even when you try to ignore it. Our conversations turned formal, stripped of warmth and humor. We still shared a house, a bed, but the life we shared seemed to fade further with each passing day. I didn't press, didn't ask the questions I should have. Maybe I was afraid of what I'd find out, that the woman who once brought me so much joy now found it somewhere else. Or maybe, deep down, I already knew and wasn't ready to face it. The first clue, the one that shook my resolve, came almost by accident. Rachel mentioned she'd be meeting her friends at a trendy new restaurant downtown, Harper and Main, a spot she'd been talking about for weeks. That night, scrolling aimlessly through social media, I saw a photo tagged by one of her friends with the caption, "Girls' Night Out at the Alleyway, an old bar we used to go to together." I stared at the photo, fingers gripping my phone, her friends smiling in the dim light of a place I knew all too well. My pulse quickened, but I told myself it was just a last-minute change, something she'd forgotten to mention. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Days went by, and more small discrepancies cropped up. Rachel would say she was heading out for a late workout, but her timelines didn't quite add up. Social media posts would pop up too early or too late, or she'd slip up on minor details when recounting her night. These little gaps started to form a picture in my mind, one I desperately wanted to dismiss. She hadn't given me any concrete reason to doubt her. I told myself I was just exhausted, that the long hours were warping my thoughts. "You're overthinking, Matt," I'd mutter to myself while scrubbing oil from my hands at the kitchen sink, hoping to rinse away more than just the day's grime. It was easier to blame my suspicion on stress. Confronting Rachel about my doubts would make them real, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that truth. But every time her phone buzzed late in the evening or I caught her stifling a smile at a message, I'd feel that familiar weight press against my chest. I'd glance over as she picked up her phone with an almost guarded look, her body slightly angled away. The laughter, once so natural, now seemed forced, and she'd avoid my eyes when she spoke. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that my mind was creating problems. Yet, each attempt to brush off my doubts only led to more questions. One night, I lay awake beside her, listening to her steady breathing. I should have felt comfort lying next to the woman I'd shared so much of my life with, but instead, the silence felt heavy. I thought about the times she said she was out with her friends, the places and times that didn't quite fit. I clenched my jaw, trying to convince myself that it was just fatigue, that things would make sense if I'd let them go. But doubts don't fade away simply because you want them to. The worst part was the guilt. I felt like I was betraying her just by questioning her, that I was turning into the kind of man who saw betrayal in every glance. I could feel myself slipping into someone bitter, someone paranoid. Yet, despite all my efforts to silence the storm in my mind, the questions only grew louder, demanding answers I wasn't ready to find. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd come home late, the house dark and quiet. Rachel was out, and I settled into the worn armchair in the living room, too tired to do anything more than flick through channels. That's when I noticed her phone on the counter, lighting up with a notification. I'd never gone through her messages before, even with my suspicions. But something about that moment, the stillness of the house, the glow from her phone in the dim room, felt different. I walked over and picked it up, hesitating as my heart hammered in my chest. The screen showed a message preview, from someone saved as A. It read, "Last night was unforgettable. Can't wait to see you again." My chest tightened, each word sinking in with a painful clarity. Half hoping for some innocent explanation, I opened the message thread. But as I scrolled through the messages, the reality became undeniable. The texts were filled with plans, secret meetups, and words far too intimate to ignore. Rachel was seeing someone else, and it was far more than just a casual encounter. I let her phone drop onto the counter, my mind swirling with a mix of anger, disbelief, and a deep sense of betrayal. The kitchen, once a place of warmth and shared moments, now felt cold and unfamiliar. I wanted to shout, to break something, but a crushing weight held me still. My thoughts spun, each memory of us together now tainted by the realization of what she'd been hiding. Just as I turned to leave, I heard the sound of keys at the door. Rachel stepped in, her eyes meeting mine in the dim light of the kitchen. She gave me a tired smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath my calm facade. "Hey, you're up late," she said, setting her purse down. I managed to control my voice, forcing a blank expression. "Yeah," I replied, steady but tense. "Long day." She nodded, giving me a fleeting look before heading to the bathroom. I heard the water running, and I knew confronting her in that moment would be pointless. I needed time to think, to decide how to handle what I'd discovered. Rachel may have believed she was in control of her secrets, but I was done playing the role of the blind, trusting husband. I took a deep breath, a new plan forming in my mind. If I was going to confront this, I'd do it on my terms. The next morning, I put my plan into action. Rachel had been complaining for weeks about her phone's cracked screen, so I decided to use it as an opportunity. "Hey, Rachel," I said over breakfast, flashing her an apologetic smile. "Why don't we get you a new phone? I'll treat you to an upgrade." She blinked, clearly surprised. I was usually cautious about splurging on unnecessary things, but she seemed pleased and didn't question my sudden generosity. Her face softened, and she nodded, "Really? Are you sure?" "Absolutely," I replied, masking my intentions behind a friendly tone. Inside, a plan was taking shape, and I knew I had to be careful. That afternoon, we headed to a tech store called Gadget Haven, in downtown Denver. As Rachel chatted with the salesperson about the latest models and features, I held on to her old, damaged phone, the very phone that held all the evidence I needed. While she was distracted by the displays, I stepped outside for a moment to catch a strong signal. Quickly, I initiated a data transfer from her phone to mine, messages, photos, contacts, everything. Each file felt like a heavy confirmation of the truth I didn't want to face. I glanced through the store's window, watching Rachel smile as she tested the new phone, oblivious to what I was doing. Each second dragged as the transfer bar slowly moved across my screen. Finally, it completed. I slipped her phone back into my pocket just as she waved me over, excitedly showing off her choice. "Great pick," I said with a grin, keeping my voice light. "Just try to keep this one in one piece." She laughed, giving me a playful swat on the arm, and just like that, the moment passed. We walked out with her new phone, her voice bubbling with excitement about all the new features. I played along, smiling and nodding, all while a cold sense of determination settled in me. Now, I had everything I needed. That night, as Rachel scrolled through her new phone, I sat at the kitchen table, her old phone in hand. Its cracked screen reflected my fractured state of mind. The messages and photos I'd copied over confirmed what I'd feared, their plans, their meetings, the intimacy they shared. I could feel my anger rising, but I knew I had to stay focused. Reacting too quickly would only give her the upper hand. Among the messages, I found that her lover was a man named Aaron, someone who worked as a manager at a nearby electronics store. Their conversations were filled with references to bars, parks, and even our old favorite spot, the Rusty Jack, a bar we used to visit together. Each location felt like a punch to the gut, a cruel reminder of the life we once shared. In one message, Rachel mentioned a plan to spend the upcoming weekend with Aaron in a rented cabin just outside of Denver, near a place called Pinewood Lake. She described the cabin as secluded and perfect for a getaway, hinting at the escape she'd been craving. The irony was bitter. This was the kind of trip we used to take together, back before life had chipped away at us. As I read through, an idea began to form. Confronting her now wouldn't give me the closure I wanted. If I truly wanted to take control, I'd need to play this out differently. Letting her think her secret was safe, allowing her to go through with her weekend plan, would give me a satisfaction that a simple confrontation never could. Over the next few days, I played the role of the oblivious husband flawlessly. I continued to put in extra hours at Canyon Auto, coming home tired and worn. Each night, I greeted Rachel with the same smile and idle chit-chat, giving no indication that anything was different. She mentioned her weekend with the girls a couple of times, and I nodded, even encouraged her to take some time for herself. Meanwhile, I kept tabs on her plans, tracking every detail she shared with Aaron. When the weekend finally arrived, she packed her things with barely contained excitement, her eyes bright as she set her bags by the door. She gave me a quick, almost dismissive hug. "I'll miss you," she said, though her tone lacked sincerity. "Same here," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Enjoy yourself, Rachel. You deserve it." As soon as she left, I waited a few hours to give her a head start, then grabbed my own keys and headed out. My heart pounded as I drove toward Pinewood Lake, each mile bringing me closer to whatever I'd find there. The cabin wasn't hard to locate, a secluded spot hidden among tall pine trees, with a view of the lake. I parked my car at a distance and walked the last stretch, keeping myself hidden among the trees. From my vantage point, I could see them through the large windows of the cabin. Rachel and Aaron were laughing, completely absorbed in each other. They moved around the living room, sharing drinks, hands lingering, as if they were the only two people in the world. My heart clenched as I watched, anger simmering beneath a calm resolve. This was my chance to let her live in the illusion of secrecy, just a little longer. I pulled out my phone, snapping a few photos through the window, capturing their moments together as undeniable proof. Then, with a final, steady breath, I dialed Rachel's number. Through the window, I saw her freeze as she checked the caller ID. She glanced at Aaron, masking her expression before answering. "Hey, Matt," she said, her voice light but slightly strained. "Hey, Rachel," I replied, keeping my tone calm. "Just wanted to check in, see how your weekend with the girls is going." Her eyes darted nervously to Aaron, and I could see the unease on her face. "Oh, it's good. Just relaxing and catching up with everyone." "That's nice," I replied, letting the silence linger just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "Well, I just wanted to make sure you were safe. Say hi to everyone for me." She stammered a bit, clearly thrown off. "Will do. Love you." I hung up, watching her lower the phone, her face draining of color as she exchanged a panicked look with Aaron. I turned and slipped quietly back through the trees, leaving them to wonder just how much I knew. As I walked back to my car, a strange sense of satisfaction washed over me. This wasn't over, but I'd planted the seeds of doubt, left her wondering how much I knew. It gave me a sense of control, a way to reclaim the power I felt I'd lost. The drive back to Denver was quiet, the weight of what I'd set in motion sinking in. I had no intention of directly confronting Rachel just yet. Letting her live with the anxiety and fear of being caught felt more satisfying. It would give me time to gather everything I needed for the final confrontation, to make sure I was prepared for whatever might come next. When Rachel returned late Sunday night, she tried to act as though everything was normal, but I saw it instantly in her eyes, a shadow of worry. She forced a smile, her voice unnaturally cheerful as she greeted me, filling the air with vague details about her girls' weekend. She avoided my gaze, her words careful and rehearsed. I played along, calm and indifferent, watching as she fumbled through her story. In the days that followed, I could see her nerves fraying. Every small comment I made about trust or honesty cast a flicker of doubt across her face. I let her live in that uncertainty, all while I continued to compile the evidence I had gathered. Each text, every photo, it all came together, a solid wall of proof that left no room for denial. Then came the day I'd been waiting for. It was a weeknight, and Rachel was in the kitchen when I walked in, holding a stack of printed photos, the ones I'd taken at the cabin of her with Aaron. I placed them on the counter without a word, watching her face as she processed what they were. Her expression shifted from confusion to horror, her eyes widening as she looked up at me. "Matt," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. I can explain." I raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Don't," I said, my tone cold and steady. "I don't want to hear excuses. This is about choices, Rachel. Your choices." She began to cry, her tears spilling down her face as she reached out, trying to touch my arm. "Please, Matt, let me explain. I was lonely, you were always at work." I stepped back, out of reach. I couldn't bear to hear her attempt to justify what she'd done. "Enough, Rachel. Pack your things and go." Her mouth opened, then closed, her face a portrait of shock. "Matt, please," she whispered, desperation filling her voice. "We can work through this. I made a mistake. I can change." I shook my head, keeping my tone firm. "No, Rachel. We're past fixing anything. This marriage is over." The room felt smaller, the silence thick with finality as she realized there was no undoing what she'd done. After a moment, she turned and stumbled toward the bedroom, her steps heavy with the weight of her decisions. I listened to the sound of her packing, each item a reminder of the life we'd built and the betrayal that had torn it apart. When she finally left, the door closing softly behind her, the house fell into a silence unlike any I'd felt before. For a long time, I stood in that quiet, letting the emptiness settle over me, feeling the loss but also a strange sense of freedom. In the days that followed, I moved through the house, adjusting to the hollow spaces she'd left behind. At first, it was a reminder of all I'd lost, but gradually, the silence became something else, a kind of peace. Free from the lies, the doubts, and the lingering suspicion that had haunted me for so long, I felt myself slowly returning to who I used to be. I threw myself into my work at Canyon Auto, putting in longer hours, immersing myself in each job that came through the door. The dream I'd once had of opening my own shop, Matt's Motorworks, came back into focus with a renewed urgency. The money I'd saved, along with what I'd forced Aaron to send in a quiet agreement to keep things from going public, gave me the foundation I needed to move forward. Months passed as I scoured the city for the right space, visiting old garages on the outskirts of town, each place a potential home for my next chapter. Finally, I found it, a small, worn-down garage on the edge of Denver, surrounded by auto yards and scrap lots. It wasn't much, but I saw the potential, the chance to rebuild something meaningful. With a sense of purpose, I poured myself into the renovation, transforming the rundown shop into a clean, modern space that could carry my name. The day I flipped the "Open" sign for the first time, a sense of pride filled me like nothing I'd ever felt before. Matt's Motorworks quickly gained a loyal customer base, the shop's reputation spreading through word of mouth. I hired a few young mechanics, their energy reminding me of myself back when I'd first started. As for Rachel, I heard bits and pieces about her through mutual friends and the occasional encounter around town. From what I gathered, Aaron hadn't stayed, he'd ended things once the truth came out, leaving Rachel to pick up the pieces. Each time I saw her, I noticed a sadness in her eyes, a shadow of the life she traded for a fleeting escape. Some memories still surfaced now and then, laughter, plans, and moments we'd once shared. But they no longer weighed me down. I'd come to terms with what happened, and it no longer defined me. Rebuilding wasn't just about moving on, it was about finding strength in what I'd overcome. One evening, as I stood alone in the garage, watching the sun set over the city, I felt a deep sense of closure. The silence that had once felt empty now brought a calm I hadn't known in years. I was no longer the man defined by betrayal or bitterness. I had reclaimed my life, piece by piece, and transformed the past into a foundation for something stronger. The air was filled with the familiar scent of metal and grease, a smell that reminded me of why I loved this work. As I locked up the shop and stepped out into the twilight, I realized a new chapter was beginning. I was free, finally, to embrace whatever came next, ready to face the future on my own terms.